Havala Ose had been awake since 4:47 a.m., and her body had been keeping score ever since. The English lesson ran long because one of the kids cried, something about a wrong answer and the particular cruelty of 7-year-olds, and she'd missed her usual bus, which meant she arrived at the Itaewon restaurant 12 minutes late, which meant her manager gave her the look. The one she'd been collecting like stamps since she moved to Seoul 14 months ago. She waitressed through a lunch rush that felt personal, spilled nothing, smiled at everyone, and counted the hours the way you count steps on a long hill, not looking up, just forward. By the time she badged into the staff entrance of Hotel Arum in Hanamdong, her feet had stopped asking questions. They had simply issued a statement. She pulled her cart from the supply room, tucked her locks back into the required low bun, a daily negotiation she had mostly made peace with, and rode the elevator to the 14th floor. Rooms 1401 through 1408. 3 already done by the morning crew. She started at 1406, moved through it on autopilot, corners tight, surfaces clean, the particular muscle memory of a person who has done something enough times that the body just handles it. Room 1408 was last. She knocked twice, announced herself, waited. Nothing. She let herself in. It hit her before she could argue with it. The stillness of the room, the cool air, the way the afternoon light pressed through the curtains in long, quiet bars. The bed was made. Someone had already smoothed the duvet with the kind of carefulness that meant whoever stayed here was either very neat or very private. She started on the bathroom, then the surfaces, then stood at the foot of the bed and looked at it. Just for a second, she thought. She sat on the very edge, just the edge. Then, because 14 months of 3 jobs and 2 short nights will eventually collect what they're owed, Havala lay back against the pillow, still in her uniform, one shoe working its way loose from her heel, and slept. She did not hear the door open 40 minutes later. She did not hear anything at all. The first thing she registered was the light. It had shifted, too warm, sitting at a different angle than it had been, and somewhere in the soft place between sleep and waking, her brain acknowledged this before the rest of her did. Then she felt the pillow beneath her cheek, the duvet under her palm, the particular quality of silence that a room holds when it is not empty. Her eyes opened. He was sitting in the armchair across the room, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a document open on his knee that he may or may not have actually been reading. He looked up when she moved. He did not look surprised. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was comfortable with it, which was somehow worse than either of those things. Havala sat up so fast the room tilted. She was off the bed before the sentence had anywhere to go, hand flying to her hair, finding the locks half escaped from their bun, one side of her collar folded in on itself. Her shoe had given up entirely and was lying on its side on the floor. She pushed her foot into it without looking down. I am so sorry. This is never... I'm so sorry. He closed the document, unhurried. Are you hungry? He asked. The question was so far from anything she had prepared for that she just stood there for a moment, holding the edge of her cart like it might keep the floor from moving. No, she said. No, I need to go. I'm so sorry. He didn't stop her. He didn't say anything else. He simply watched her collect herself with that same unreadable patience, like he had nowhere to be and no particular feelings about any of this, and that calm, so complete, so unearned, itched at something under her skin even as she backed toward the door. She was in the hallway before she remembered to breathe. His scent reached her a half-second later, caught in the fabric of the pillow she'd carried the warmth of. Cedar and something faintly sweet, like the first note of a citrus she couldn't name. She clocked out 20 minutes later and told nobody. His name she did not yet know. But he had seen hers, small and black and clipped to her chest the whole time. Havala. He had not used it. She thought about that on the bus home, longer than she meant to. She almost called in that Wednesday. Her feet were still recovering from the weekend. She had a headache that had been making itself comfortable since Tuesday, and the Itaewon restaurant on a Wednesday night was never worth what it paid. But rent didn't negotiate, so she laced up her work shoes and took the subway out. The first hour was quiet. A couple near the window who tipped well. A table of university students who couldn't agree on anything. A businessman who wanted his coffee refilled every 15 minutes, like it was a personal project. She was reaching for the coffee pot when the door opened, and she looked up out of habit. Her hand stilled on the handle. Park Joon walked in the way she imagined he walked into every room. Without announcement, without effort, like the space had been waiting to organize itself around him. He was with an older man who was already talking. Joon was listening with that same quality of attention she'd witnessed from an armchair, total and slightly unnerving. The host seated them in her section. Of course. She gave herself 3 seconds behind the service counter, which was 2 more than she needed and 1 less than she wanted. Then she picked up the menus and walked over. He saw her before she reached the table. She watched it register, a small shift, something that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Good evening," she said, professional and smooth, distributing menus like she was entirely unbothered. "Can I start you both with something to drink?" The older man ordered without looking up. Joon looked at her, menu untouched. "Water is fine," he said. Then, with the precision of someone who had been waiting to use something, "Havala." Her name in his mouth, for the first time. Said correctly, no stumble, every syllable exactly where it belonged. She smiled the way she had perfected for difficult tables, and wrote nothing on her notepad, because he had ordered water. "I'll be right back," she said. She was professional all evening. When she set the bill down, his companion had stepped outside for a call. Joon didn't open the folder. "3 jobs," he said, not a question. She met his gaze. "Have a good evening." The tip she found afterward was borderline offensive in its generosity. She stood over it for 4 full seconds, thought about leaving it, and slid it into her apron pocket. On the subway home, she looked at the ceiling and... The envelope was waiting for her at the front desk on Friday. One of the morning receptionists, Yuna, who collected other people's business like a hobby, held it out with the energy of someone delivering evidence. "A man left this for you yesterday. Very tall. Quiet." She paused meaningfully. "Nice hands." Havala took the envelope, thanked her, and waited until she was in the staff room to open it. Inside was a card, cream-colored and plain, and the handwriting was deliberate, not the rushed scratch of someone used to delegating everything, but careful, like each word had been placed. "Dinner, if you're willing. Saturday." No obligation attached to this invitation. Park Joon. A restaurant name was written below. A time. A number to call if she had questions, which she thought was a very composed way of saying, "If you want to say no, say it here." She read it twice, turned the card over, blank, and then set it on the bench beside her. Her colleague Dami walked in mid-change and immediately read the room. "What's that?" Nothing. Dami had the card in her hand before Havala could argue. She read it. She read it again. She looked up with an expression that belonged on someone who had just witnessed something sacred. Is this how Korean men ask women out? Havala asked. Dami stared at her. No. This is how one specific man is asking you out, and you need to understand that this, she held the card up, does not happen. Havala took it back. It's just dinner. It says no obligation attached. He pre-addressed your hesitation. In handwriting. Dami sat down heavily. Havala, go. She thought about it through her shift. She thought about the armchair and the patience in it. She thought about her name in his mouth, placed correctly, like he'd practiced. She thought about the tip she still hadn't entirely justified to herself. She texted the number that evening. 4 words. Saturday works. Havala Osei. The reply came in under 2 minutes. A time, an address, and then, I'll make sure the reservation accounts for your preferences. Do you have any allergies? She stared at her phone screen for longer than she'd like to admit, something warm and inconvenient settling in her chest. She typed back her answer. He replied, noted. 1 word. She was smiling before she could stop herself, and that bothered her most of all. She told herself, getting dressed, that it was just dinner. She told herself this while cycling through 3 outfits, landing finally on a rust-colored wrap dress she'd bought on sale and never worn because there had never been anywhere worthy of it. By the time she pushed through the restaurant door and saw Park Joon already standing, not seated, standing, waiting for her, the sentence had lost most of its conviction. The restaurant was quiet, in the way expensive places perform quietness. Joon was in a dark, fitted shirt, no tie, and he smelled tonight like warm amber and something green she associated with early mornings. He looked at her the way she was beginning to understand he looked at most things, completely, without apology. They ordered. The menu had no prices on her side, which she noticed and chose not to comment on. The food arrived in courses, each one better than the last, and somewhere between the second and third, the conversation found its footing. He asked about Accra, not the surface version, actually asked, and then listened, the way she'd noticed before, like he was building something from it. She told him about her mother's fabric shop, the scholarship that brought her to Seoul, how the program ended and pride had made her stay anyway, assembling a life from whatever was available. I'm not tragic, she added, because she'd seen the look before and didn't want it from him. I didn't think you were. I think you're practical. There's a difference. She looked at him. Something true, she said. Tell me something true about yourself. He considered it seriously. I run a company that does well because I understand the gap between how people want things to look and how they actually are. I'm very good at that gap. Honest, without being complete. She filed it. Then 2 men appeared at the table's edge, low voices, eyes that didn't settle. Joon excused himself. 4 minutes, she counted. He returned and steered the conversation elsewhere with a smoothness that would have worked on almost anyone. Who were they? She asked. Work, he said. She nodded slowly and let it sit. They walked to the subway afterward because she'd asked to. At the top of the station steps, the city moved around them, indifferent and loud. I'd like to do this again, he said. She looked at him, past the composure, past the 4 minutes still in her back pocket. I'll think about it, she said. He smiled. Small, genuine, the first one she'd seen reach his eyes. She was still thinking about it when she unlocked her apartment door and stood in her kitchen, in her rust-colored dress. She was going to say yes. She already knew that. She just wasn't ready to stop making him wait. She chose Hongdae on purpose. Not to test him exactly, but not to test him either. If Park Joon only existed inside quiet restaurants where menus had no prices, she wanted to know that now, before the warm, inconvenient thing in her chest became something she'd have to explain to her mother. The art market ran along a stretch of street that smelled like fried dough and oil paint. Students sold prints from fold-out tables. A woman threw pottery on a wheel while people watched. Somebody's playlist cycled through genres without apology. Joon arrived exactly on time, in a gray pullover, and he looked like a man who had been briefed on casual, without quite having lived it. But he didn't complain, didn't check his phone. He followed her from stall to stall with his hands in his pockets, asking genuine questions about technique and material. At a table of ceramic pieces, she picked up a small bowl the color of sea glass and turned it over in her hands. "My mother collects things like this," she said. "Anything small enough to hold." "Does she know you're still here? In Seoul?" "She knows." Set the bowl down. "She doesn't ask how it's going because she knows I'll tell her when there's something worth saying." "That sounds lonely." "It sounds practical. There's a difference." She returned his words without emphasis and watched something shift in his expression. She bought the bowl. He reached for his wallet on instinct, and she stopped him with a look that required no translation. He put it away. They ate tteokbokki from paper cups at a street stall, and she laughed when the sauce caught his throat and dismantled his composure for about 4 seconds. The most human she'd seen him. She felt the last of her careful distance start to quietly give. They walked until the market thinned and the evening settled, cooler now. He stopped at a low wall, and she stopped beside him, the city spread below in lights and noise. "The men at the restaurant," she said. "I'm not asking for details. I'm asking if I should be concerned." He turned to look at her, and she watched him decide, visibly, to stand on the honest side of the gap he'd described at dinner. "There are parts of what I do that exist in spaces most people don't see," he said. "I keep them contained. You are nowhere near any of that. I would not allow otherwise." Not a full answer. They both knew that. But it was true, and she had learned enough to know the difference. His hand found hers on the wall, not grabbing, just settling, warm and unhurried. She turned her hand over and let their fingers fold together. They stayed like that while the streetlights finished coming on, and she thought that this, his hand, the sea glass bowl in her bag, the smell of fried dough still on the air, was the kind of thing she might tell her mother about, when there was something worth saying. Havala was covering a Wednesday shift when the man sat down uninvited at the service counter. 50s, well-dressed in the way that wanted to be noticed, with the confidence of someone who had decided in advance how a conversation was going to go. He waited until she was checking an order, then spoke in English, deliberately. "You're the one he's been spending time with." Havala looked at him with the calm she'd perfected for difficult tables. "I need you to be seated in the dining area, sir. I know who you are. I know where you work." A small smile with no warmth anywhere in it. "All 3 places." She set the order slip down. "Just a message," he continued. "Tell Park Joon that So Changwon says the Mapo arrangement isn't finished. He'll know what it means." He stood, straightened his jacket, and left. She noticed her hand was very still on the counter. She made herself pick up the order slip. She finished the shift. She called Joon when she got outside, and he picked up on the second ring. She told him plainly, the man's name, his words, the 3 places comment. The silence on his end changed quality, the way a room changes when the temperature drops. "Where are you?" "Outside the restaurant." "Stay there." 11 minutes. He came around the corner in a dark jacket and looked at her first. All of her, quickly, before anything else. "He didn't touch you?" "No." Relief moved through his expression and dissolved immediately into something harder. She had wondered, in the abstract, what Park Joon looked like angry. Now she knew. It wasn't loud. It was a stillness so concentrated it had its own weight. "So and I have unfinished arrangement I should have closed months ago," he said. "He used you to reach me, and that won't happen again." "What does finished mean?" she asked. "I need to understand what I'm standing next to." He told her, not everything, but enough. A territory dispute, old money, older grudges, resolved within the week through channels she didn't need to know about. It was the most direct he'd ever been. She stood with it, the weight of his world pressing briefly against hers. She had known, in the way you know things before you're ready to say them, what the edges of Park Joon looked like. She had chosen to stay anyway. "I'm not running," she said, "but I need you to know I'm not someone things happen to while you manage everything from a distance. If we're doing this, I'm not kept somewhere safe and decorative." Something shifted in his face, a man recognizing solid ground for the first time. He reached out and tucked a loose lock behind her ear, hand staying at her jaw. "I hear you," he said. She believed him. By Friday, So Changwon's name had stopped mattering. That Saturday, she cooked jollof rice and fried plantain in her small apartment, music from her laptop, and Joon sat on her kitchen counter, eating from the pot before she'd finished. She pointed a wooden spoon at him. He took another piece of plantain anyway. It was ordinary. It was the best evening she could remember in 14 months. She quit the hotel housekeeping shifts in March. Not because Joon asked her to. He hadn't, and she wouldn't have received it well if he had. But because a design studio in Mapo offered her a junior position after she'd spent 3 weekends rebuilding her portfolio from scratch. When she called her mother to tell her, Margaret Osei sat on the other end of the line in Accra and cried quietly, in the way she did when she was trying not to. "I knew," her mother said. "I just waited." "I know you did." The studio changed something in her posture that Joon noticed without commenting on, which was exactly the right response. They had argued twice. Real ones. Once about his habit of making decisions that grazed her life before consulting her. Once about her disappearing into silence when overwhelmed rather than saying so. Both times they found their way back to the table. She had decided that was the thing she trusted most. Not the smoothness, but the returning. It was a Friday evening in April when it happened. She'd come from the restaurant, let herself into his apartment with the key she hadn't made a ceremony of accepting, and found him in the kitchen, sleeves up, cooking something that smelled like garlic and sesame. He looked over his shoulder when she came in. "Rough one?" he asked. "Average." She dropped her bag, pulled the pins from her locks and let them fall, and something about that exhale made him turn fully from the stove. He crossed to her, and she looked up at him, and the warm, inconvenient thing that had lived in her chest for months arrived quietly at its destination. His hand came to her face, careful, asking, and she answered by closing the distance herself, because she had never been a woman who waited for things to happen to her. The kiss was unhurried. It tasted like the wine he'd been cooking with, and something that was just him, and his hand found her waist, and she let herself be held without negotiating with it, which for Havala was its own kind of milestone. When they parted, he stayed close. "I should have done that in Hongdae," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "You should have." She felt him smile against her cheek. She called her mother the next morning. Margaret picked up before the second ring. "Tell me," her mother said. So Havala did. All of it, from the beginning. Room 1408, the armchair, the name tag, the careful handwriting on cream paper, Hongdae in the sea glass bowl, the kiss that tasted like wine on a Friday evening in April. Her mother laughed in the right places and went quiet in the others, and at the end said simply, "He sounds like someone who knows how to stay." Havala looked across the room to where Joon stood at her window with his morning coffee, looking out at Seoul like he had nowhere else to be. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think he is."